In 1892, a woman named Mercy Brown died of tuberculosis. Later that year, her body was dug out of the ground, her heart and her liver were basically removed, they were burned, and a potion was made from the ashes. She was also decapitated. And so what we're going to talk about today in Monsterology is the sort of New England vampire scare or vampire panic. And in particular, we want to look at the case of Mercy Brown. All right. So here's the final image. It's really two images stacked on top of each other. On the top, you've got the desecrated corpse of poor Mercy Brown. And then I did a drawing, an ink drawing below it of the actual community that dug up her body and cut her head off. Sort of animated by the moonlight there. So it's worth talking a little bit about vampires. I mean, most of us know about Dracula, Bram Stoker, but there was an earlier story by Le Fanu called Carmilla, which was about a female vampire. And this had a big influence on Bram Stoker, and it's a wonderful novella, short story about female vampires with a pretty intense lesbian subtext, not even really subtext. And it's a wonderful sort of play on desire and blood drinking and strangers coming in the night. And this has been a constant theme in vampire literature. And in more recent years, we've really had a full flourishing of this tradition with, books and films like Twilight, where you have teenage desire like being sort of represented by vampires, and the vampires are hot and sexy, and the story I'm telling today is not quite as sexy as that. It's just really more sad and disturbing, but it's the real case of Mercy Brown, who was thought to be a vampire by her family, or really by the community. What you're seeing here is I penciled in the drawing of these guys around a grave, and this was based on an old sketch I saw, or an etching I saw from this time period, and I drew it in with pen and ink using a quill pen. Now I'm sort of adding a wash of water around the figures and characters, so I'm going to drop in ink, and that's what you see me doing here. When you drop that ink in to that wash, it just sort of explodes into these wonderful organic forms, and you really can't reproduce that any other way. It really gives a wonderful effect, these washes. Now I'm using a sable brush and just brushing in the shadowed areas to give myself a sense of, well, how the moonlight is casting on these characters. And also I wanted to give the impression that there's some light coming out of the grave. So it was a little tricky to get that right. I don't know if I ever really achieved it, but that was my goal here. Anyway, the idea of the vampire, I think, is really, it's very old, but there's sort of references to vampires and blood drinking in the ancient world, but it's probably John Polidori's novel in 1819 called The Vampire that really gets the modern version going. Then Le Fanu writes Carmilla in 1872, and then more famously Bram Stoker's Dracula appears, some 20 years later in 1897. And then we see other permutations of it, like Richard Matheson's I Am Legend comes out in the 1950s, and Stephen King's Salem Lot is in 1975. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampires is in 76, and then she creates a whole series of vampire chronicles based on that. And then the Twilight saga is in the sort of 2005 to 2008 in terms of the books. And then the movies are obviously later than that, I think 2008 to 2012. A lot of great vampire narratives in cinema and television. Nosferatu is in 1922. Universal's Dracula with Bela Lugosi is in 31. And all the way up to things like True Blood, The Vampire Diaries, a great European film called Let the Right One In, which many of you have seen. Okay, here's the final drawing. I'm fairly pleased with how it turned out. It's creepy, it looks nostalgic. These guys are gathered around the grave, digging up Mercy Brown. And now I'm basically starting on this drawing. I did it sort of in reverse order here. Now I'm doing Mercy Brown herself, and I tried to do kind of a, not a realistic drawing, but an illustration, and kind of a something that had some charming qualities to it, even though it's a creepy and violent sort of subject matter. I wanted to sort of reduce that quality and play up some of the more humorous, or I don't really know, nostalgic qualities of the imagery. So the actual story is that in the 1800s in New England, there was a lot of tuberculosis, and it killed many people. Really, no one knew what caused it. Our understanding of tuberculosis was pretty pathetic. Most people infected with the bacteria that cause tuberculosis, they don't have symptoms. But when symptoms do occur, they usually include cough, sometimes blood-tinged cough, severe weight loss, night sweats, and fever. And the superstition was that the disease, which they called consumption at that time, was actually consuming the victim. And the superstitious version was that the victim's undead relatives were doing this. So sort of vampire relatives were to blame. So when a person began to waste away with the disease, people dug up the graves with their family members and they decapitated them as a way to sort of stop what they feared was occurring, which is this vampire outbreak. And in 1892, Mercy Brown, this was basically Exeter, Rhode Island. She died at age 19 of consumption, and many of her relatives were also dying of this disease, which is understandable because of the way tuberculosis travels. But it led some people in the community to theorize that Mercy was a vampire. And when they dug up her body, they found that she had not decomposed much, and she still had blood in her heart, which, if you think about it, is a pretty gruesome exhumation of the grave and cutting into the body and so forth. Most people believe the reason why she seemed fresh was because she sat out in the frozen New England winter. You can't really bury somebody when the ground is frozen solid, so she was essentially preserved in a sense until they could bury her. So that accounts for the strange vivacity of her corpse. So what they did is they basically took her heart and liver out of her body, and they burned those and made a medicinal potion. And the reason why they did this is because her brother, Edwin, who was a little bit older and who had traveled back to the region from the west, was himself now sick with consumption. And he was in bad shape. So the belief was if they took the heart and the liver from his sister and he drank this potion, which just seems really macabre to me, then he would get better. Just a quick notice on the drawing here. What I'm doing is rolling over that drawing with a kind of thinned out acrylic mixed with a matte medium. And when that dries fully, you can use these colored pencils to go in and start adding the highlights to create depth and shape and volume to the forms. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm using a charcoal pencil to sort of draw in her rib cage and the cavity where they removed her heart and so forth. Anyway, they gave this potion made of the ashes of her heart and liver to her brother Edwin, but not much of a surprise here. He died about 2 months later anyway. So that is really a shocking story in a way, because it's so recent. I mean, 1890s is not that far away. It's not that long ago. And this is really a depth of superstition that surprised me when I first did the research on it. It wasn't long after the death of Mercy Brown here that scientist Robert Koch won a Nobel Prize for figuring out what the bacteria was that caused tuberculosis, and that was in 1905. So we're talking about very close in terms of its time frame. Tuberculosis went down dramatically in this country and everywhere in the world when pasteurization was introduced, in terms of, because cow's milk seemed to transmit it as well as, people coughing and so forth. Some fairly famous people have died of tuberculosis. It was sometimes thought of as the romantic disease because so many artists talk about it and died from it. John Keats, Frederick Chopin, Thoreau, George Orwell, Franz Kafka. So good news to live in the time of immunizations and pasteurization and so forth. All right, so that wraps up the discussion then of Mercy Brown and the New England vampire panic. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll subscribe to the channel for more content, which comes every week or every other week. All right, take care.